Follow the conversation. This is Afternoon on the Dove.
There we go. Good afternoon. Welcome to Afternoons on the Dove. I'm your host, Perry Atkinson, and today we have a very special guest, and we're delighted to have back with us today Dr. Michael Berry. And Dr. Michael Berry is the Director of the Pastoral Care at the Cancer Treatment Centers of America, where he specializes in the connection between faith and health, and he has served in ministry for over 20 years. He's appeared on numerous radio and television talk shows. Perhaps you've caught him on the 700 Club or even maybe one of the major network programs as well. We're going to talk about the connection of unforgiveness and health, and in particular maybe even cancer. And also we'll be giving you some information about Release, the healing power of forgiveness. It's a special program. Dr. Berry, what a delight to have you back with us today.
It's great to be with you, Perry.
First of all, tell us a bit about your role there at the Cancer Treatment Centers of America.
Well, I'm the Director of Pastoral Care here at CTCA in Philadelphia. And one of my primary responsibilities is to meet with new patients as they come into the hospital. They usually come in on a 3-day orientation, and for about 30 to 45 minutes, I get a chance to essentially spiritually triage them to try and help meet their most immediate needs, and certainly let them know whatever other benefits that they have relative to spiritual support here at the hospital.
Well, you've authored a book called The Forgiveness Project, starting discovery of how to overcome cancer, find health, and achieve peace. And I was asking you before we went on the air today, the connection between unforgiveness and cancer. Help us make that connection.
Sure, it's actually not too terribly complicated. It works this way. Whenever we experience unforgiveness, which I understand to be the retention of the negative emotions of anger and hatred toward the perpetrator of harm, whenever we internalize this, it creates a state of chronic anxiety. Chronic anxiety very predictably does a number of things. One of the things that it does is it causes our body's immune system to underfunction, which creates a really good environment for bad things to happen, including the facilitation and the growth and spread of cancer. We're really not saying anything more than the National Institute of Health says about psychological stress. It tells us that it facilitates the growth and the spread of cancer. It doesn't create cancer. And we're certainly not saying that finding forgiveness and the release of these negative emotions is going to cure it. But what we do know is that it does create a really good environment to facilitate the growth and the spread. So our cancer patients come to us looking for the best possible care for their cancer, and ignoring the emotional wounds that so many of them bring with them is just not even an option for us.
Wow. So, as I told you before, we've done a couple of shows on forgiveness, and I was surprised, quite frankly, at the response. And one of the things that we found out from doing this topic in the past, that a lot of people will say with their mouth they forgive somebody or some situation, when in fact deep down in their heart and their soul they're still struggling with it. And now that's showing up with your research as well. Are you surprised of the topic, or at least the issue of unforgiveness is so pronounced when people come into your clinics?
Well, here's the background that I bring. 18 years of parish ministry. And, you know, we pastors go into the ministry to help people, often finding our time and energy drained away to, preparing sermons or, various committee meetings, and we disconnect ourselves from our parishioners. In a pastoral care setting at a cancer hospital, our only job is really to listen to our patients, to be with them and to walk with them during this very devastating time of their life. And because we're listening so much more here, the stories that I hear so often are forgiveness-related stories. People who have emotional wounds that happened in their life, sometimes recently, but very commonly, in the years that have gone by. And I can diagnose it very clearly as a Christian as being a forgiveness-related program. But here's another thing that surprised me. I had 18 years of parish ministry. I had 8 years of formal theological education, and I found that I did not have the skill sets to be able to help people find forgiveness, even in the midst of the need that I saw so evidently here. By the way, a research project that we did showed that 61% of our patients self-assess themselves anonymously with forgiveness issues. 34%, 1 in 3, diagnosed themselves with severe forgiveness issues. So we knew our patients were struggling with forgiveness-related issues, but felt helpless to be able to help them find that. And so I began 6 years ago formally trying to study this thing to see if I couldn't help my patients learn how to put their past in their past, which I'm sure you'd agree with me is where it belongs.
No question about it. What are some of the signs of unforgiveness? I mean, I know that you see it as it shows up physically, but when you begin to deal with this on a patient who maybe has already been diagnosed with cancer, what are some of the other signs you see that maybe unforgiveness is the issue here?
Well, there's a number of signs. Probably the most obvious one is depression. There are, dietary concerns. There's rumination, where people have a difficult time even to stop thinking about these things. It affects their sleep. It affects them in a wide range of ways. But depression is one of those words that we hear about, kind of like forgiveness, where it goes in one ear and out the other. We don't pay a whole lot of attention to it, but we realize that life joy siphoned off. The number one cause for depression and suicide ideation in divorced women, by the way, is forgiveness related. So to say that it is related to depression is no small thing, but it does affect a number of the other bodily functions. Your cardiovascular system, there's a good deal of research on that. The immune system, as I mentioned to you earlier, your digestive system. So it affects our entire body, mind, and spirit.
All right, before we get too deep into this, let me just also say to our listeners and viewers, you're more than welcome to join us today. The phone number is 776-5366, and we can conference you in with Dr. Michael Berry. And you may want to make arrangements to pick up a copy of his book, The Forgiveness Project. And let's see, it's put out by Kurgel, so you may want to check that out as well. Dr. Berry, a couple of things here. The Forgiveness Project, what is it?
It is essentially the culmination of 6 years of researching and working daily with cancer patients on the topic of forgiveness, trying to help them not become better aware of the role that forgiveness can play in their life, helping them develop and reconnect with some social relationships that might have gotten disconnected. For people who are facing a chronic and sometimes life-threatening disease, forgiveness can be a way for people who know that they should forgive and never did find some sense of peacefulness as they face their own mortality. So it serves a wide range of functions. But the Forgiveness Project is a book that I've written that essentially crystallizes a number of things that we've learned about forgiveness.
Now, you also have another program called Release, The Healing Power of Forgiveness. And how does people obtain that information or become a part of that?
Sure. You can find out about our forgiveness education program by going to releasenow.org. On that website, you have a chance to listen to patient testimonials from a number of our cancer patients. There's other information about cancer as it relates to forgiveness, as well as ways to connect with us directly through phone or to buy the book as an example. So that's our website. The program itself, Perry, is a forgiveness education program that we have taken all over the East Coast. We've gone as far as Ohio and been out to Arizona a time or two. We offer it free to the churches because, again, one of the null curricula in many of our seminaries, in fact, I have yet to find a seminary, medical school, or university that teaches its pastors, MDs, or psychotherapists how to help people learn how to forgive.
Wow.
And you would think that if there's any skill set that any of us as Christians we ought to have, it ought to be forgiveness. But unfortunately, I've even talked to pastors. I've talked to evangelists and asked them if they've ever preached on the topic of forgiveness. And they've all said yes. But I said, have you ever helped people find how to do it? It just isn't there. And so we feel like we're trying to take information, Perry, that is known very readily in the research institutions, Duke Medical School. A number of my colleagues are involved at research on forgiveness. What I'm trying to do is to take the information that they have very readily been able to identify and understand the benefits psychologically and physically, and bring it down to the person in the pew, as it were. And I guess, in the end, that's what the book and the website are trying to do, is to get some very practical information to the people who are hurting the most.
Have we unfairly regulated forgiveness down to a simple prayer? I mean, we think, well, if you just pray this prayer of forgiveness, somehow God takes over and everything's taken care of.
You know, that's a great question. And I would say this to you, that after I give my forgiveness education program, which usually it takes between an hour and 3 hours, I send people home with homework. Again, forgiveness is a process, Perry, that begins with a decision to forgive. It ends when you have had what Jesus referred to as a change of heart, forgiveness from the heart in Matthew 18:35. You know, from the beginning and the decision to forgive to the end is, it's very predictable. But the reality is that there's barriers along the way. There's various sorts of resistance to doing it. But after I have taught everything on the topic of forgiveness, I send people home with homework. And do you know what the first thing I ask them to do? I ask them to pray for their enemies. That's the very first thing that needs to take place. They need to pray for their enemies. It's not just great theology, and as Christians, we all understand that it's what Jesus has taught us to do. And by the way, I come from the cloth that says there really are some things that we ought to let Jesus have the last word on, and forgiveness is one of them. There's one thing that ought to make us unique as Christians, and that's how we treat people with whom we are in disagreement. And it begins with praying for them, blessing them, and not cursing them. And so we send people home with job one, to pray for their enemies. Now, that's great theology, but we also know from the scientific research that your willingness to pray for your enemy just one time dramatically increases the likelihood of being able to forgive them. And so it's great science. It's great theology. You know, the challenge is, Perry, is trying to invite people who've been wounded very deeply by someone, inviting them to take this very big and bitter pill.
Wow.
Forgiveness can be a very big and bitter pill because it requires you to go back in your past. It requires you to remember things that you've spent a lot of energy trying to forget. It invites you to go back and to revisit these wounds, which in many cases, if not all of them, cause a level of anxiety to go up. So inviting people to pray for their enemies is a very important part of this. Now, it just so happens that there's a nice intersection, Perry, with what's taking place. We know theologically and with the research, but we also know from research in post-traumatic stress disorder that as soldiers go to Afghanistan and Iraq, and they have, or the Vietnam War for that matter, and they have these horrible experiences, one of the great challenges that they have in helping them deal with post-traumatic stress disorder is to rehumanize the enemy. When someone hurts us, we typically demonize them. And guess what? You don't want to forgive a demon. What do you want to do? You want to destroy them, and you can usually come up with really good reasons to do that. The challenge is, and this spans all of the research on forgiveness, the challenge is to try and put a human face on that person. Because the person who hurt us, as much as we may hate them at any given moment, is not a demon. It's a human being, flawed, broken, damaged goods, but a human nonetheless. And so prayer, I think, is the first step to being able to rehumanize them. Wow. And to place their broken humanity before a loving and merciful God.
Wow. I got to take a break here. When we come back, there's a couple of things. First of all, I know that you have much to say as we move towards the 10th anniversary of 9/11, and what do we do with that in our hearts as Americans? And then the other thing I want to talk about right when we get back is, how do you deal with the emotion of anger when somebody hasn't forgiven? One of the side effects I have dealt with is they are pretty angry people, and it's hard to get past that emotion. So maybe you can help us with that when we come back. We're talking to Dr. Michael Berry, and he's authored the book, The Forgiveness Project. And we more than welcome to take your calls if you want to join us, 776-5368, whether you're watching on TV right now or you're listening on the radio. You're welcome to join us. We can conference you in, 776-5368. We'll be right back.
Follow the conversation. This is Afternoon on the Dove. Follow the conversation. This is Afternoon on the Dove.
Okay, we're back, and we're talking to Dr. Michael Berry, and we're going to reconnect with him. We are Skyping him from his office in Philadelphia, so we're delighted to have that technology available. And, of course, his whole area now is just on the aftermath of Hurricane Irene, so they're still somewhat in the recovery mode there. But anyway, he has headed up the Forgiveness Project. He's also head of pastoral care with the American, let me get the right pages here, the Cancer Treatment Centers of America, excuse me, and a very interesting topic about forgiveness. And Dr. Berry, do we have you back?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay, thank you. And I realize that you folks back there are still dealing a little bit with Irene. Did you get hit pretty hard, by the way?
You know, it didn't hit us as badly as we had thought. The flooding north of us in New Jersey and New York seems to be a lot worse than we've experienced in Pennsylvania, but we're thankful that it wasn't any worse than it was.
All right. We're thankful for that. All right. When we were going to the break, the subject of anger, and help me to understand this, because it seemingly when I have dealt with people who are dealing with, or maybe not recognizing that they are dealing with unforgiveness, it's hard to get past the anger issue. I mean, they're just angry. And you said something that really triggered with me, that we have a tendency to demonize the people that maybe have hurt us, or maybe we've misunderstood, and that becomes the target instead of unforgiveness. How do we handle this?
Well, what we teach is that anger and hatred are two different emotions. You know, you can be angry at a child but not hate them. Anger is the feeling we feel whenever we lose control. There's not one cancer patient in my hospital that doesn't have a low-level hum of anger. And the reason is because they don't want to be at the hospital. They want to be home living their life. And so there's some lack of control which creates feelings of anger. Hatred, on the other hand, is when you have an extreme dislike toward a person. We think that unforgiveness is essentially a function of hatred. We hate someone, not necessarily anger. Sometimes people can be angry at someone, and over time it can grow into full-blown hatred. But we try and show those as being essentially two different emotions, with forgiveness being primarily focused upon hatred. What we compare it to, Perry, imagine I've got a cup of water in my hands, and that water represents hatred. When you pour the water out of the cup and right it back up, it's not suddenly full of love. I mean, that would be, beyond anyone's imagination. But what it's not full of is hatred any longer. You have a sense of peacefulness. Another illustration, since we've been through the earthquake and now the hurricane, imagine, for example, that you have a building that the hurricane comes in and knocks completely flat. That represents our lives after a severe trauma. The reality is that people's lives are simply never going to be the same. In our forgiveness program, we're not trying to pretend that you're going to be able to feel the same way about someone that you felt before the pain. We're not trying to suggest that life is ever going to be normal, as you would have defined normal as being, going back in your past. Soldiers, for example, you take some 18-year-old young man that goes to Afghanistan, he has a horrible firefight over there. That young man is never going to be the same. Post-traumatic stress disorder and treatment for it does not promise that it's going to take you back to a state of normalcy. What it helps you learn to do is to rebuild your house, depending on your foundation. And that's where forgiveness comes in. When you rebuild your house, you can live a good life and you can do great things if you have a solid foundation. And that's where we think our faith comes in. Building your renewed house, your new house, your rebuilt, your reconstructed life on the solid foundation of Jesus Christ. That's what we try and teach people to do. And that foundation looks like peacefulness. We feel it as though it is a sense of the absence of hatred, and even to the point of being able to pray for your enemy, this kind of altruistic concept of being able to even lift them up before a loving God. So the question is, what's your foundation when it comes time to rebuild your life?
What do you I know that families can be affected by people who are dealing with unforgiveness, and sometimes it plays itself out in a very hard way to the people that are closest to you, the one that you love the most. What do you say to the person who now beginning to see the effects of their unforgiveness in their family? And what do you say to the family members in trying to respond and help the person who's dealing with unforgiveness?
There's a story in my book, Perry, about Kathy. Kathy went through a horrible divorce, and it was just devastating upon her and her life, which I'm sure you can imagine. She, not too long after that, diagnoses with cancer, and she realizes the traumatic effects of her hatred, her perfect hatred, by the way, toward her ex-husband. She hated him with a passion, and this had a tremendous impact upon the kids. She got custody of her children, but they had visitation rights every other week, and
Okay, I wonder if we lost connection with him here. Sorry about that. Well, let me, sorry about that. We're talking to Dr. Michael Berry, and he's authored the book, The Forgiveness Project, the startling discovery, of how to overcome cancer, find health, and achieve peace. And the subject is huge, to say the least, and we have dealt with it a lot here. We'll make reconnection with him in just a moment. We do have one book to give away, so we'll be listening about that coming up in just a few moments. In the meantime, if you want to join us, we'll try to conference you in. The phone number is 776-5368. So let me take an early break and see if we can come back and connect with him again. We are dealing with him from Pennsylvania, which is part of the area that was impacted by Hurricane Irene. So chances are our connections there are being interrupted with still some recovery process in that area from the hurricane. We'll take a quick break and we'll be right back.
Follow the conversation. This is Afternoon on the Dove. Follow the conversation. This is Afternoon on the Dove.
All right, modern technology being what it is, we've made reconnection, but we had to do it via phone because the Skype isn't holding with, I guess, maybe some aftermath of hurricane back there, Hurricane Irene, Dr. Berry back there. But you're with us on the phone?
Yes, I am.
Okay, great to have you with us. Again, he's authored the book, The Forgiveness Project, the startling discovery of how to overcome cancer, find health, and achieve peace. And also, let me just quickly remind you, there's a couple things you can do here. The website, again, releasenow.org.
Correct.
And they can get a lot of information there. And let me just encourage you to let that be a real resource for you. There we have it up on the screen for you, releasenow.org. All right, before we went into the break and we got interrupted there, we were talking about the effects on family. And I guess it's a two-pronged question, Dr. Berry. One is those who are suffering from or with unforgiveness eventually begin to see that their problem is having an effect on other relationships very close to them. And then yet the family members are beginning to see that as well. What's some advice there we can do to help people with this?
Well, I was mentioning a story about Kathy that I wrote about in the book and her perfect hatred for her ex-husband. She got custody of the kids, but the kids had visitation rights every other weekend. Well, the dad that Kathy was describing was very different than the dad that they actually saw, which created some just cognitive dissonance in the children. I mean, they didn't know who to trust. They didn't know who was it that was telling the truth about what had gone on in the relationship. And there's some research done on what's called the Medea syndrome. In Greek mythology, Jason was married to Medea, and he ran off with another woman. And Medea, in order to punish Jason, killed her two children. Well, as this has rolled out over time, researchers now realize that quite often children get the short end of the stick whenever there's a relationship, whenever a breakdown or divorce. And so my point is that Kathy was finally able to forgive her ex-husband to the point where she could even invite him over for holidays and for birthday parties and so forth. And her son, Perry, listen to this, his senior thesis was called My Mom, My Hero, telling the story about how Mom was able to forgive Dad. Perry, that transformed that relationship, And my guess is that transformation is going to continue throughout the generation. It's just an amazing thing. Whenever we have forgiveness issues, it doesn't affect just us. It affects people who are around us, just like cancer. You know, it's something that affects the entire family. Feelings of hatred and anger do that as well.
Let me ask a couple basic questions, and then I want to move over to the 9/11 issue. How do we start? What's the first thing we should do when somebody really has hurt us and we have this unforgiveness? It could be an ex-spouse, and I realize those feelings and emotions run very deep. It could be a business associate. Who knows what the situation is? But what's some of the very basic things we can do to move towards forgiveness?
Well, I mentioned earlier to pray. I mean, it sounds so incredibly, simple. But to pray for your enemies is the sine qua non a piece of advice that I could give anyone. The second thing that people need to be aware of, Perry, is that there is innate desire to want to avoid dealing with these things. In post-traumatic stress disorder, it's referred to in the literature as a disease of avoidance. People don't want to go back in their past. They're hoping that time will heal these wounds, when in reality, that doesn't happen at all. There was a young woman who came into my office many years ago when I was in parish ministry. She came in. I didn't know her. She just needed someone to talk to. She'd run away from home 7 years earlier. She'd gotten into some sort of argument with her father. It was the straw that broke the camel's back, and she ran away from home. She came into my office, and she's just venting. You know how sometimes pastors just hold people's emotional buckets, and she was just, for 20 minutes, just pouring out her heart. And finally I said to her, let me ask you something. Have you ever thought about forgiving your father? And she says, I forgave him a long time ago. I mean, we Christians say the words. We know it's the right answer. I mean, anyone who's been in a church for 10 minutes knows that the answer is it's either Jesus or forgiveness. But actually letting it go and trying to make sure that people choose in a very intentional way to deal with their pain is the point. Because we develop a new emotional baseline, a new norm, and someone says, how are you doing? You say, I'm fine, when in reality, it's been so long since you've been happy, you don't even know what it feels like anymore.
The other thing is I would assume that it has a tremendous impact on our own ability to really feel and accept forgiveness for ourselves.
Well, the last chapter of my book is on the difference between self-forgiveness and self-acceptance, if that's what you're speaking about.
Right.
We teach that self-forgiveness is not biblical. We also know from research, Perry, that the people who can forgive themselves most easily tend to be very narcissistic people. They just say, okay, well, I'm going to forgive myself and walk away without really taking, the time to think about a person's behavior upon those who are around them. They make it all about themselves. The research seems to suggest that the reason why it's in our culture, and by the way, self-forgiveness has only appeared in the psychological literature in our culture in about the last 15 to 20 years. So it's a relatively new phenomenon, and the reason that that's the case is because people feel as though we're becoming such a narcissistic culture that, of course, just forgive yourself and pretend like it didn't happen. And that we don't want to encourage any narcissistic behavior because we don't think ultimately it's a loving behavior to model.
I am so glad you said that. Thank you for saying it. I've struggled with that for quite some time. It just seems to be so self-centering, and I'm glad you were able to make that distinction. Let me conference you in. Frank, you're on the air with Dr. Berry. What's your question today?
Yeah, hi, Perry and Doctor. How are you doing?
Good.
Hi, Frank.
I'm from Philadelphia also, Doctor, and I used to do a lot of work with an internship with Jefferson Hospital and Hall Mercer, Pennsylvania Hospital. And, of course, this is back in the 70s and 80s. But what we found back there was there was a high correlation between what we call not psychosomatic, but somatopsychic, that people would carry a lot of feelings and emotions locked into their bodies when released with various modalities such as rolfing. These things would be released, and the patient, you would see, improve greatly. What do you think the correlation between something like that could be perhaps caused with unforgiveness?
Well, if you're talking about the mind-body connection, the psychosomatic, again, to repeat what the National Institute of Health has said about the role that stress, psychological stress, plays on the immune system, which, of course, being at Cancer Treatment Centers of America is my primary issue, is that it causes a dramatic reduction in the production of natural killer cells, which is your body's foot soldier in the fight against cancer. And so from a cancer standpoint, we know it's very relevant. But there's also a lot of data out there, primarily within the realm of post-traumatic stress disorder and these traumas that men and women have had in war, and its impact upon the cardiovascular system and so forth. And we can even see from 9/11 the health consequences for the trauma that they've experienced there. So we would say that, you know, we know too much about a person's emotional well-being to ignore it in the treatment of cancer. Mm-hmm. It's unforgiveness is now appearing in medical literature as a disease that can be treated and even avoided if you know how. Mm. So I think more and more people are aware of the mind-body connection, and I'm happy to be able to pilot something like this here.
Good work. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Berry, let's move over to the 9/11. This is huge. As you know, in 2 weeks we'll be coming up on the 10th anniversary, and there's so much going on with this now. I guess one of the great controversies is that Mayor Bloomberg has not even allowed the clergy to be recognized during any of the ceremonies or public display of faith, which is, to me, is a whole nother big argument, and it maybe could even create another level of unforgiveness. But we're trying to figure out, you know, how do we heal from this? We are genuinely angry to what's happened to our country. What are you recommending here?
Well, I know this, that 9/11 is to our country what the diagnosis of cancer is to a cancer patient. I mean, it parallels almost perfectly. There's a sense of shock. There's an overwhelming sense of sadness because of the loss. People feel vulnerable. They're trying to figure out what in the world happened and how can it possibly be prevented. But also, Perry, out of the rubble of all of that emerge heroes. And we see extraordinary heroes battling cancer. We see caregivers that are heroic. We see physicians who are able to help treat patients in extraordinary ways. But also part of this experience, Perry, is that we also identify enemies. And whether it's, you know, Al-Qaeda or whoever our country's enemies might be, the same thing's true for a cancer patient. You know, they wonder what went wrong, who was it, or how can they better understand. You know, they'd never smoked and so on and so forth, and suddenly they find themselves. But often, as I've mentioned to you earlier, Perry, they sense very frequently that the cause of their cancer was an interpersonal issue that went wrong. I had a physician talk to me the other day who made well into the six figures for many, many years. He developed colon cancer, and the reason that he believes, this is a physician now, the reason he believes he got colon cancer was because his wife spent him into bankruptcy. And it became a gut issue for him. And so, we look for enemies, we look for reasons, but as soon as a Christian says the word enemy, they also must realize that forgiveness is in the offing as well. So it's a time, I think, in our country, particularly as Christians, to begin to look at our attitudes toward our enemies, begin to rethink how many people in Vietnam only found healing when they went back to Vietnam and ended up having to face their enemies face to face, the rehumanizing aspect of it.
You're not suggesting, or maybe you are, but is true forgiveness always ends up in reconciliation, or can they be separated? Can forgiveness and reconciliation be two separate events?
Well, we teach that they're two separate events. Reconciliation requires two or more people. Forgiveness requires one person. And so when, in the situation of 9/11, we certainly are not suggesting in any form or fashion that justice shouldn't be mediated. Clearly, God is a God of justice as well as a God of mercy. He says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You tithe mint and cumin and dill, but you neglect the weightier matters of the law, like justice and mercy and faith." So justice and mercy go hand in hand. But when we encourage people in light of something such as 9/11 to do is to look at the foundation. Their lives have been devastated. Our country will never, ever be the same again. It just won't. We have changed forever. Mm-hmm. The question is, what kind of foundation are we going to rebuild our country on? Is it going to be a good foundation where we can do great things? Or is it going to be a foundation built upon hatred and anger and all of those negative emotions with some very predictable results, I would suggest?
I'm really concerned about that. Being in media as we are and tracking a lot of the media sources out there, there seems to be a very angry spirit in the national discourse. And even as we go into an election cycle, there seems to be this really rough, rigid thing. And we may lose one of the very things that makes our country great, and that is to be able to forgive and turn around and actually minister to those who have abused us. I mean, look at the wars in the past. We go back in there and help people. And if we don't do it this time, what are we doing to ourselves?
There's a book that written, Achilles in Vietnam, and it talked about the process that soldiers go through. Soldiers go to fight, and fighters go to kill. We don't have to look any further than Nazi Germany to see the effects of dehumanizing people. Mm-hmm. And so I think the challenge for us, and again, it's cognitive dissonance. We're holding both the idea of having an enemy and seeking justice alongside forgiveness. And again, what I've mentioned is that it's a big bitter pill. But nevertheless, once the cyclone has gone through, once we have been laid out and we begin to rebuild our lives or our culture or our country, to me, the question is, what kind of foundation are we going to build on? And as Christians, I can't help but think that that's a foundation of forgiveness. Otherwise, I do not understand the Christian religion. It is inseparable from forgiveness. The cross is emptied of its meaning apart from that. And again, I'm not suggesting it's easy. I am suggesting that it's the right thing to do.
Well said. The book is called The Forgiveness Project, The Startling Discovery of How Overcoming Cancer, or How to Overcome Cancer, Find Health, and Achieve Peace by Dr. Michael Berry. And let me encourage you to get a copy of this book. We're going to give away a copy here in just a moment. Dr. Berry, let's come back to some of the very fundamental things that I find in this topic to be so sensitive. And that is, how can we self-examine ourselves to find out if we're suffering from unforgiveness in our own heart?
Well, it's a little bit like this. People do not come to me and ask me if they fell in love. They know they fall in love. I mean, it's unmistakable. What we invite people to do, Perry, is to fall out of hatred and into a place of peaceful indifference. And that's unmistakable as well. So, at the end of the day, I think that falling out of hatred is a feeling or emotion that we know in our heart of hearts that's taken place. But to give you another metaphor, I don't know if you've ever been to a carnival where they have that whack-a-mole, where the heads pop up and you're just furiously hitting the top of these moles as they pop their heads up. Right. Well, that's a lot like the process of forgiveness too. When someone hurts us, we're just whacking the heck out of those things. We're a lot of energy behind it. But once you've forgiven, the heads pop up, but we don't even pick up the mallet. The memories come and they go, but it doesn't create the same level of anxiety around it. And that's forgiveness. We're never going to forget what happened. It's an indelible part of our life. We'll never be the same in many respects. But again, that doesn't mean that we can't rebuild our lives upon a solid foundation of love and peace and forgiveness.
Well, it's been wonderful. And Dr. Berry, thank you. I'm sorry for you had the technical problems that we've had today. And hopefully you and all of you along the East Coast there continue to get your lives back together after the impact of Hurricane Irene. So thank you for tolerating those interruptions today. But your work is fascinating, and I want to commend you for it. It's an incredible topic. One that I have learned to deal more and more with here on the air is we're finding out that people really do want to get healed from unforgiveness. It's an incredible process. Let me encourage our listeners. ReleaseNow.org is his website. It's a great resource for you to take advantage of. ReleaseNow.org. Check out the Release, the Healing Power Forgiveness Project. Pick up a copy of the book. It's called The Forgiveness Project, and by Dr. Michael Berry. Dr. Berry, thank you. Can we get you back when we can get things kind of connected a little bit better next time?
Absolutely. My pleasure.
Thank you. God bless you, and thank you for your work.
Thank you, Perry.
God bless thank you. All right. Again, the book is called The Forgiveness Project, The Startling Discovery of How to Overcome Cancer, Find Health, and Achieve Peace. You know, let me just say to our viewers and listeners, you know, not only we've had Dr. Berry on, but our own Patrick Doyle, we've dealt with this topic. And usually when this subject is over and the program is over, the phones light up. And this is one of those issues in our lives, especially as believers, in the community of believers. I think we need to take a long, hard look at, are we forgiving those who abuse us and hurt us? Are we really doing that, truly doing that? Pray about it. Pray for those who despitefully use you, the scripture says. All right, caller number 2 at 776-5368. We'll get it. Caller number 2. Thank you, and we'll see you tomorrow.